Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. We're about to begin our session titled South Asian English Fiction, Where Mythology and History Meet. The speakers are Uzma Aslam Khan, Kamila Shamsi, Beena Shah, and the moderator is Muniza Shamsi. Please switch off your mobile phones and put them on silence mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the discussion. We would appreciate if complete silence is observed while the session is in progress. Muniza Shamsi is a writer, critic, bibliographer, and the author of Hybrid Tapestries, the development of a Pakistani English literature from colonial times to the present. The book is forthcoming by Oxford University Press. Her extensive work includes 3 anthologies which she has edited, including the award-winning And the World Changed, Contemporary Stories by Pakistani Women. She is a regular contributor to Dawn and Newsline. Muniza.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to... Can you hear me? Right? You can't? Can you hear me? Yeah. Some mic needs to be... Oh, right. Okay, thank you. Whoops. Okay. Happy to introduce my 3 panelists. They're all very well known to you, but here's a rough sort of summary. Uzma Aslam Khan is the author of 4 novels, 3 of which have been shortlisted or longlisted for major awards. Her 3rd, Geometry of God, won the Bronze Independent Publisher Award in the United States, and her 4th won the KLF Fiction Award. All her novels refer in different ways to history, antiquity, myths, or legend. But her 4th, Thinner Than Skin, which is set largely in Kaghan, juxtaposes the changing pattern of life among the nomads of Pakistan's northern areas with that of a Karachi-bred and American-bred tourists. And in this book, the legends of that region, including that of the Nanga Parbat mountain and the lake Saiful Mulk, live and breathe among its inhabitants. Beena Shah is the author of 4 novels, of which 3 look at the city of Karachi and its various divisions, class, ethnicity, and faith. Her 4th was published in an Italian translation first and won the Primo International Award, but it appeared in 2014 in an English version, A Season for Martyrs. She has many references to Shah Abdul Latif's Risalo and the Sindhi heroines known as the 7 Queens. And she takes a grand sweep of Sindhi history, including anecdotes about Bhitai, as well as Alexander Burns, Pir Bakaro, and many others. And all of these are interwoven into the tale of a young Sindhi journalist in Karachi who witnesses and writes about Benazir Bhutto's return to Pakistan in 2007. Kamila Shamsi is the author of 6 novels, all of which have been shortlisted for various awards. In 2013, she received the Tamgha Imtiaz in Pakistan and was among the 20 writers of Granta's Best Young British Novelist. But mythology or oral lore runs through most of her novels, ranging from references to Leda and the Swan and Odysseus to Layla and Majnu. But in her 6th novel, A God in Every Stone, which is set in Peshawar, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the subcontinent, the story is set before, during, and after the First World War, and it revolves around a group of archaeologists. And so it takes a look at history, or rather descriptions of the subcontinent, as recorded by travelers such as Herodotus and Skylax in ancient times. So I'm going to begin with Uzma, and the first question I would like to pose, beginning with Uzma and then Beena and Kamila, so maybe they can just take it in turns. The first question I would like to pose the panel is, what is the relationship between history and mythology and your work and your specific books? What is the link between storytelling and mythology? And where do stories and history merge to become legends? And what is the power? You can address any of these. What is the power of legends and storytelling versus history? So, Uzma, if you could please begin.
Okay, those are a lot of questions. So I've been thinking a lot about this connection where mythology and history meet, and what this has to do with me as a storyteller, and specifically my works. And the first thing that occurs to me is that all myths are invented stories. Some are joyous and expansive, others are jingoistic and serve to sort of narrow our understanding of history and discourage an honest inquiry of history. I think in Pakistan we're very familiar with both kinds. A little, just personally, I wasn't taught very much about my own history in school. A lot of us who went to English medium schools say the same thing. It wasn't encouraged in school or at home, really. We didn't really talk about it. And the history that I was exposed to was, like if, for instance, independence movement, it was always independence from India, not Britain. The Arabs liberated this land from the infidels, or Pakistan was created with the arrival of Muhammad bin Qasim. I mean, these are the creation myths that we've all heard and that we've unfortunately grown up with. But not knowing my history and not being encouraged to know it has actually been a motivator for me. And I think I've realized as I've developed as a storyteller that a lot of what I write comes from an urge to make up for what was never said. And for me, one of the most meaningful ways to do this is to explore the physical sensory world. My characters seem to dig, sometimes quite literally, for their roots. And I can give just two very quick examples because I don't want to take up too much time. The first is from my book, The Geometry of God, which came out about 8 or 9 years ago. One of the protagonists is a character, Amal, who, when she's 8 years old, stumbles across a rock that turns out to be a fossil of great importance. So Amal grows up really wanting to know the history of the earth that created her. She wants to be a paleontologist like her grandfather. But one of our other myths, and this is a pretty universal one, is that public spaces belong to men. And so Amal is not encouraged, neither by her family nor by people at her work, to go out into the field and dig with the men. So she's confined indoors in a lab where she prepares the rocks that the men bring back into the lab. But this doesn't dissuade her from her passion, and it actually encourages her to develop another sense, another sight. And at the time, as she's sort of scraping away the dirt from the fossils, she also starts to realize things about her culture and her history that were not, to look beyond the history that she was taught. For instance, at a shop, she notices a shopkeeper stashing rupees in a shrine that she had never noticed before. It's a very small sort of shrine that was covered by paint, and his fingers accidentally grazed the belly of a smiling Hindu god. And this is in Lahore. The book is mostly set in Lahore. Or the new deities scratched in the railings of a terrace, and she had never noticed the deities before. So, her eyes start to peel away the paint in the way that her fingers kind of scratch away the dirt and the clay from the rocks. And in this way, she looks deeper at her past and comes to a realization of a more multi-layered and inclusive history. So that's the Geometry of God. Just one last quick example is from my book, Thinner Than Skin, which is the more recent one. In this, I've explored some of the more joyous myths that I mentioned earlier. We have both kinds. The book is mostly set in the valleys of Kaghan and Hunza. And, this is an area, if you've been there, that is very rich in story, and every glacier, every mountain, every lake has a story. And a lot of them have to do with names, like where did the names come from. So the book is partly set along the banks of the Lake Saif al-Muluk, And the lake, as some of you may know, got its name from a prince who one day came to this part of the world and saw a fairy princess bathing on the banks of this lake. And there was a jealous jinn who had also been watching the princess, who attempted to drown the lovers, but they sought refuge in a cave. And both the lake and the cave play a major part in my book. One of the characters in the book, Mariam, she's from a semi-nomadic Gujjar tribe. She has a very intimate relationship with her physical world, with the changing of the seasons, and the naming of the stars, and the animals are named after the stars. For sensitive souls like her, the world is pluralistic and inclusive, and she celebrates Diwali and Nowruz. She practices Islam and animism. She doesn't see any conflict there. So for her, everything alive is in movement, and everything that moves is alive. And I think in writing her story, I was trying to create a myth that we can still stubbornly hope for a world where everything alive is in movement and everything that moves is alive. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Morning, everybody. So it's an interesting question, the link between history and mythology and storytelling. And I have to say that when I came to writing A Season for Martyrs, I wasn't very clear about the distinctions between all three. I think sometimes when you're muddled, it's better because the lines blur and the energies of each category feed into each other, and you produce something that's quite a bit more holistic than if you just took it in its separate categories. As a child, I grew up with all three. Of course, history was something that I learned in school, at a desk in front of a teacher, and immediately thought of it as very boring and very academic. Mythology was something also somewhat academic, somewhat distant. I learned it reading books of Greek mythology, Roman mythology, American myths, fables, so on and so forth. But it was in my home, listening to the stories that my parents told me, and especially my father told me about family lore, family connections, politics, so on and so forth. And those were the stories that caught my imagination, maybe just because they were presented to me as living tales, tales about people that were known to us or known to my father, a friend of my grandfather's, my great-granduncle, so on and so forth. So they always felt a lot more alive to me than the figures of mythology or historical figures. Now, when I sat down to write A Season for Martyrs, I knew that I was really bad at history, really bad at dates, not my favorite subject. So I had to pin it very strongly on something chronological and something historical, and that came to me in the form of a fantastic book by Sara Ansari, Sufi Saints and State Power, which delineated very clearly the phases in which Sufism in its elemental state slowly and gradually became fused with the instruments of political power, especially in this province. But as I examined and analyzed the book, I kept seeing where connections were being made to the historical figures that I had been told about in family lore. For example, Pir Bagara, who was a friend of my grandfather's, and I'd heard many personal stories about him as a person, as a man, and I'd heard that his father had been hanged by the British. So history sort of became alive because I had access to it from a different angle. And when I started writing, then I started filling in the blanks. And I have to say that I think I took mythology, the legends of the Sufi saints, I took them as, not as myths, but as things that really happened. And I think you have to have that attitude if you are writing about mythology. You have to write about it as if you truly believe it happened. That's the only way to have credibility in the book, and that's the only way to really convince your readers. There was one major legend that powered the book, and that was the legend of Shah Abdul Latif's 7 queens. These are the historical figures. I can see some smiles of recognition. You know the stories, Marvi, Sassi, so on and so forth. And so there were 7 of these women that Shah Abdul Latif Bhittai wrote about. These women were women, but they were also symbols of the love between God and his followers, and the separation that man feels when he's not in unison with God, when he's living on this earth separated from God, excuse me. So these legends were of these women who physically lived out that separation by being separated from their earthly lovers. And by God, they moved heaven and earth. They stopped at nothing to bridge that gap, to be with the people that they loved. They risked everything. They risked death, and some of them died in order to get there, to reach God, to reach that mystical union. So that concept, which I take very much as a feminist concept, women with power, with agency, with independence, the right to choose their lovers, I took that very much as inspiration. And then I hung the later part of the book, Benazir Bhutto, who was also a big driving force behind the book. Benazir Bhutto, the fictional character, though, rather than the historical figure. And I feel like I created a new legend by merging the 7 queens with the figure of Benazir. And I actually go so far as to call her the 8th queen. And I made it up that Shah Abdul Latif predicted the arrival of an 8th queen, which was Benazir. And I constructed the story in such a way as to make that very plausible. And so I have had a hand in creating a new legend. That gives me a lot of power, and it gives me a lot of satisfaction as well, because now I feel I'm also a part of that history. So history is not a dead thing in a textbook. It is something alive. It is something we are creating all the time. The people that live, they die, they turn into legend, they turn into myth, and they live on for generations.
Thank you very much. Kamla?
There are a lot of interesting things in what both Uzma and Beena have said, which I'm going to try and weave into here. Particularly that question of storytellers and the creations of myths and legends. In A God in Every Stone, there's an actual historical figure, and I'm advisedly using the word historical rather than mythical or legendary. There's an actual historical figure called Skylax. Skylax was the first man we know of, the first person we know of, to come to what is now Pakistan from somewhere else and write about it. So in approximately 515 BC, the Persian Emperor Darius sends this traveler Skylax with some ships to chart the course of the Indus River and then return to Persia, basically with navigational information so that Darius's armies can come and conquer the area, which of course happens because the whole area, until that point, Darius's empire extended to a place called Kaspateros, which is either Peshawar or Attock. And after Skylax, he came and conquered the Indus, so everything up to the Indus. But Skylax, in addition to taking navigational information, also took back stories, because all the early travelers were great storytellers. It's a relatively recent phenomena to separate geography from fiction. Right? I mean, it's something I write about in cartography, that one of the roles of travelers and of geography was to tell metaphorical truths in the language of story. So Skylax came to Peshawar and to all the regions we know of, and then took back mythological tales. I mean, he invented these tales of the tribes of India, such as the Skyapods, who had huge feet. And when the heat of the afternoon sun got too great, they would lie on their backs and raise their legs, and the shade falling from their huge feet would cover them and give them shade. Right, so these kind of stories. So in my novel, I invented an artifact. There's some historical reason for thinking such an artifact may really have existed, but I went further and said that there was an artifact belonging to Skylax. And I have an English archaeologist arrive in Peshawar in 1915 looking for this artifact. Skylax is a man of history. He's little known. I think he should be better known to us as the first person to come in and tell the rest of the world about us. For 200 years, he shaped the Greek and Persian imagination about the subcontinent. Most of what Herodotus writes about India is stolen from Skylax. But in the book, you have an English archaeologist who comes to try and find this artifact of Skylax. And then you have a young Peshawari boy called Najib. Najib is also, he's going to grow up to be an archaeologist. He's also interested in the artifact. But he is a man of Peshawar, well, a boy of Peshawar. And he recognizes that this is part of his history because Skylax started his voyage from Peshawar. He wants Skylax to pass into myth and legend within his city. It's not enough for him to then go and find this one artifact which will then be possibly taken to the British Museum or maybe the Peshawar Museum. What he does is he goes into Qissa Khwani and he says to one of the storytellers that make a story of Skylax and tell this story in Qissa Khwani, make it part of the Bazari stories along with Layla Majnu, along with the folk stories of the great Pashtun warriors. Because even at 11 he understands that if you want to take a character out of just historical fact and make that character enter the bloodstream of a place, you put them into story. And then they stop just becoming history and move into either legend or mythology. The distinction between legend and mythology, I think we can probably define it in different ways. I would say a legend is possibly someone who acquires a certain fame, everyone knows the story. But for something to enter into myth, you start to feel it part of your cultural DNA. It explains something about yourself. It becomes part of your heritage. And so when Uzma talks about sort of creating myths of the future, myths of what we can still be, I think in some way that's also what novelists are more interested in than merely retelling myths of the past for the sake of saying this happened here. We also want to say, look, this is who we were, it's still in us, we could still be it. It's why I think one of the great mythical stories of America, the great myths of America of the last 50 years, was Star Trek, rather than anything else. In 1966 here, it's the height of the Cold War. You have nuclear standoffs and an arms race, and in the middle of this, there arrives this fictional tale in which you have a craft on which you have a man called Chekhov and you have a man called Kirk, and science is not being used to kill each other. It's being used to explore, it's being used to travel in some kind of harmony. And it was a different kind of myth, a myth that said, look, we can still be this. This is a better version of us than now exists. And I think fiction writers are more interested perhaps in the myths of the future, even if we're using the myths of the past to construct them.
Do either of you have a comment on that, or shall I? Do you have a comment on that? Are you involved in myths of the future than the past? I think you more or less covered that.
I think we are. If we don't write to just we want to dig the past, but we also want to look ahead. I mean, we're trying to do both when we tell stories. So I mean, I would just reiterate that there's nothing. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that interested me was the power of the oral narrative versus the written word. Bina has just mentioned how the stories told to her by her father, were much more exciting than history. And in Uzma's book, in the Karan Valley, the nomads, the legends live and breathe. I mean, the way the way the sunlight passes across the mountain reflects its mood. I mean, they're like living creatures. And yet when you get the tourists coming, although they know the legend of Saif ul-Mulk, which is a part of poetry, it's not the same. So what is the difference? What is the power of the oral narrative versus the written word? And the oral narrative also, do you think it's being lost? Does anyone want to take that question?
Yeah, I think it's very much the human energy, and it's the idea of performance. Storytelling is performance because it's happening right in front of you. For example, you can read the surahs of Shah Abdul Latif on the page, and they seem very flat as compared to if you go to the shrine and you hear the malang singing and performing within context, with the people around you. That's its power. I think it's a very simple equation.
I also think that it's about relationships. So when you talk about, what these myths mean to people who live there versus what these myths mean to people who are visiting, tourists, the relationship is not going to be the same. So for instance, Maryam, who's from the land, sees the mountains Malika Parbat and Nanga Parbat really differently because she has inherited a story from her mother about how these two were lovers. And she sees the signs, the clouds, the melt of Malika Parbat and the lake changing its current. I mean, she is very sensitive, very attuned to the moods of her environment in a very different way from somebody who doesn't live and breathe it. So the relationship cannot be adopted or even understood necessarily. You have to spend time in the place in order to really absorb it.
Can I just say, Uzma, I found those elements of the book very powerful in a feminine way. I found the relationship that you spoke of earlier, Maryam and her environment, and she's so sensitive to all the changing moods and tides. I just found that extremely powerfully written and very feminine.
Thank you, Mina.
I mean, it's interesting to think in terms of between the oral and the written. One of the central issues that's also rising is who has access to formal education that allows them to write. And in a lot of cases, for a lot of history, and you still unfortunately find this true where we live, the education of boys is given much more priority. The written narrative is more likely to be the masculine narrative, whereas the oral narrative is something you can't, a woman without education will still be invested in the oral narrative. So there's an interesting gender break in that as well. I became very interested in Qissa Khwani when I was researching the book, and unfortunately I don't know Pashto, so I couldn't go and get access to the stories, but there was an article I found where someone who speaks Pashto had translated an example of the badla, of the tales told in Qissa Khwani, these rhyming couplets full of diversions and distractions, and they were living things, where the Qissa Khwan might, in the course of telling the story, sort of throw in a couplet referring to someone in the audience. Or they might throw in a few couplets that would link this mythological story they were telling to something that had happened on that day. So in the time of the British, it became a powerful tool, that you could tell stories of someone who had fought the British 100 years ago at the moment that the Fakir of Ippi was doing whatever he was doing. And it became a story of today. And whoever was writing this tried to make the case that, it's still to some extent alive. And he said, well, in the 80s, for instance, the Qissa Khwans had gone, but you could still buy cassettes with these sort of badlas on them about the Afghan Mujahideen and the war going on next door. But I thought actually it's not even about oral and written, it's about oral and live. So a thing on a cassette is not going to have that urgency of, I can add in couplets to refer to what happened 5 minutes ago. So there's a sort of living quality to the oral narrative. But the other problem is that the written narrative long ago asserted that it was right, that it had history on its side, that, things in the retelling will shift, whereas what is written must be true because it's remained unchanged since it was written down. Which again brings us back to masculine, feminine, and sort of one thing being given more power and value than the other.
Well, one of the questions actually I wanted to ask, because Bina referred to Benazir, creating the legend of Benazir. In Kamla's Broken Verses, she's got the mother who was a WAF activist, and that's part of the legend that the daughter grows up. What creates a modern legend? I mean, why hasn't the massacre of Peshawar that you write about in 1930 why hasn't there been a subversive, I know it was hushed up, but why hasn't there been a subversive legend about it? There's, few people from Peshawar that I met do know about it, but the rest of us don't. This horrific massacre in Qissa Khani Bazaar, which was hushed up in the 1930s. Do you have a comment on what creates a modern legend and what doesn't?
I can speak very specifically about the 1930 massacre. Of course, in KP, it's still remembered. And on that day in April, it's often commemorated, particularly if the ANP is in government, they will have a holiday marking the day. We don't know it about in the rest of the country, but there's another reason, which is too many people were guilty around it. So the British were responsible for the massacre, but one of the things that I found while researching it was that sort of allies of the Congress helped with the cover-up. So there was a lot of, on both sides there was some shame, and because it's associated with Congress, the International Congress and their allies, in Pakistan, most of us don't want to really claim it as our history because they were anti the Muslim League. So what you need is enough people in power, if it's going to be a centralized narrative, to agree that this is part of your legend. But it's very important to remember that within Peshawar, it's absolutely remembered. So as a local legend, it survives. So there's also that question of, what makes the local legend then the national legend.
Yeah, and I think that difference between a local legend and a national, we see this everywhere. So, for instance, I mentioned a character, Maryam from Thinner Than Skin. Maryam's name is taken from a real legendary character from this region who I don't think is known outside this region, Maryam Zamani. That's the legend. She's a legend in Kaghan. Maryam Zamani was a girl who would who would fetch water from the well every morning, but on her way to the well, there was a boulder, and she had two choices. She could either walk around the boulder or she could walk over it. If she walked around it, it would take forever. If she walked over it, she would cut her feet, and it would hurt. So Maryam Zamani was sort of fed up that she had only two ways to overcome an obstacle. And so she decided that there had to be a third way. And what the third way is something that the character Maryam has to deal with when she encounters an obstacle, which is an injustice that was done to her. But her third way is to fight for justice without confronting it head on, or without avoiding it by walking around it. So this story of, how do you overcome an obstacle? Do you walk around it, or do you confront it head on, or do you come up with a third choice, which is through art? Is known in the region, but I'd never heard it outside of the valley. So I think it's really interesting what stays local and what sort of spreads, and it has a lot to do with what's written and what's just transmitted orally. People, I don't think there's any written documentation of this story. I just heard it.
Do you have any?
I'm sorry, I forgot the question.
No, it doesn't matter. We were talking about local legends versus national legends.
Oh, I see.
But no, I wanted to ask you. There's always this great debate about matriarchal versus patriarchal legends. Is this so within our legends within the subcontinent? Are there clear patriarchal and matriarchal legends, and if so, what are they, and how do they define us? Or is this a European or a non-subcontinental construct?
I think that mythology and legends are a lot more equal and democratic than we give them credit for. But I think what happens is that in the recording, we were talking about this before the session, the voices of women get erased because it's the men writing the history. And this is always the problem, whether it's within a religious text or a historical text or the mythology itself. I think the women's voices, women's presence, women's influence and roles are very much downplayed. And it's almost it's a sociological decision, it's a political decision as well, to recast women as mother figures without the power of the mother. The mother figure is a very powerful archetype it's not the only archetype. There are women that are warriors, there are women that are, seers, there are women visionaries, there are women leaders, politicians, queens, you name it. But it's almost as if we're rewriting history by recasting women really only as the leaders within the four walls of the home. And so when we go back to the idea of matriarchal lore, matriarchal legends, they don't serve the current patriarchal agenda, the current patriarchal
So that
thinking and system.
that way the seven queens don't get the emphasis they deserve.
As you reminded me, Anna Marie Schimmel, the great German scholar of Shabd al-Latif Bitayan of Sufism in Sindh, remarked on the seven queens and drew it out. And tell me again what it was that she said to you.
Well, it was a long time ago, but she said, how could one not relate to the Risala when it's got these women with whom she identified so strongly?
And really, when I was doing my research, there were bits and pieces. But nobody had really come out and said, look at these strong women and look at what this means for what life was like in Sindh and what it's like today. And nobody had really sat down and made the analysis. But again, as it was for Dr. Schimmel, it was so clear to me. Shabd al-Latif was definitely a feminist. He was definitely in favor of strong women. He admired them. He wanted to promote them, project them. And he used them to say something very important about the relationship between the divine and the mundane.
Well, I would just add that, we here in our land is rich in matriarchal stories and matriarchal legends. And yes, I agree totally with what Veena has said, that there is a rewriting of this, an erasing of this, and you see it everywhere. And again, I'm going to reference Kahan and Hunza because that's sort of where my book is set. But, there are shrines to goddesses, and there are women shamans who, smoke juniper leaves and go into a trance and see visions, and they have power, and mystical power, and this is something that the last time I was there, I wanted to talk about this, and there was a big difference between the last time and the time before, where people were not wanting to talk about it as much, and the devotees to these goddesses were having to practice in secret. So there is, a kind of an overtaking of the patriarchal story, that the patriarchal history sort of crumbling over, literally physically taking over the physical remnants of these shrines. They are being covered, they are being concealed, all the little ways in which tribute was paid, leaving food or yak tails or whatever it may be. It's no longer happening as visibly as it had been happening in the past. But I also want to say that the erasing of it doesn't mean that it's necessarily winning, because it's still being done in secret, and there is that power that is still being handed down. And one of the things that one of the characters in the book says to the other, there's a proverb, have you filled your mouth with flour? And this was translated to me, and I don't speak the language, so I don't know if it's a good translation. But this is a woman's language. This is the mother telling the daughter, have you filled your mouth with flour? And flour here means, have you learned to speak correctly? Which means, do you now have the power to pass on these tales to your children so that they can practice religion, in this particular way. So I find it very interesting, this women's language versus male language, and I think it has a lot to do with the matriarchal legends versus the patriarchal ones as well.
In the Peshawar Museum, there's a wonderful statue of the goddess Hariti, and she's next to her consort, who's a warrior prince, and it's very clear he is the consort, she is the goddess. But even so, if you look at her, she's a fairly, benign looking character, and she has this cornucopia with sort of fruits and vegetables coming out of it, and children around her. The original goddess Hariti was a demon. She was a demon goddess who was worshipped out of fear, and the story around her was that she had children, and she would feed her children other children, as in they were cannibals. So she would go and she would find your children in the village, and she would bring them back and give them to her kids for dinner. And she was a terrifying figure and worshipped in the area that was Gandhara. After Buddhism came along, one of the things we don't hear about nice, gentle Buddhism is the female deities were sort of pushed to a side or domesticated. So Hariti then became the goddess who protected children and the goddess of childbirth. So this fierce demon warrior who would kill your children, they couldn't get rid of her. That was the important part. It was impossible to say Hariti will no longer be someone who you worship. She was too deep in the culture. So instead she was domesticated and made into something safe. But she still got to keep her consort.
One of the things that struck me about Beena's book was that she's got an episode about Shah Abdul Latif, and he's writing these wonderful poems, and people tell his wife that he loves the 7 queens more than he loves you. And, she this kind of wounds her. And I wanted to ask all the authors, what is the difference between life and art? Where are the divisions? How is it transmuted? What are the links?
I'm not sure there is a division.
Oh, right.
Yeah, life is art. Art is life. It sounds horribly cliched when you put it that way, but it's really true because you have to live your life with a certain art to it for it to make any sense. Otherwise, life is chaotic and life is very cruel. But if you can fashion a sort of art out of your life, then I think you are able to move through it with some dignity. And the incident that you mentioned from the novel, I mean, her response to that and his response to it both is very dignified. He refuses to listen to the gossip. She cries, but silently, as women usually do. And she doesn't complain about it. And I think that they, as a couple in the novel, had already dedicated their lives to certain values and certain ideals, which were very lofty, very artistic. And of course, he was a poet, so he was a living artist. That's not to say that he wasn't a human. He may have loved the 7 queens a little bit more than his wife. He may have not. But the point is that you get to decide how much of your life is to be lived the way that you want to live it, and whether that's with artistic ideals or spiritual ones or what have you. That's your choice.
Do you comment on that, on life and art, and what becomes fiction and what is... You obviously do.
Well, lots of things are going through my head. I mean, I think for me, I would like there not to be a difference between life and art, which is, I mean, for me, writing is oxygen. I have to do it. But there is a difference because I have to pay bills as well. And I have to work, and I need an income, and I have to, pay the rent and my electricity bill. And I don't put that in my art necessarily. So art is a place where a deeper, sweeter, and maybe also angrier part of me emerges, whereas life is often, from day to day, is just getting down getting it over with. The pragmatics take over sometimes, and life does interfere with art. I think life happens to artists, and we can't always control that, even if it's an ongoing struggle to find a balance between the two.
I think art is often the attempt to impose, if not control, then certainly the illusion of control over things that are horrifying. I mean, the world is horrifying, right? I mean, the world is completely horrifying. Artists, even the ones who are producing work that reflects brutality, there's a way in which they're saying, here it is on this canvas, which you can turn away from, here it is on the page. There's an attempt to, I don't say the word beauty because that sounds like prettiness, I mean a very deeper kind of beauty, to add an element of control and artifice and beauty and structure onto things that are actually unstructured, ungovernable, out of our control entirely. I think art may be sometimes the only thing that allows you to remain sane when there's actually absolutely no reason to be sane at all.
Well, thank you. I think
Can I just add one more thing to that? As you were speaking, Kamala and Uzma, there was somebody who I felt embodied that life who's no longer with us, and that's Sabine Mahmood. And
absolutely.
art was very important to her.
Yeah.
Art was probably her life's power beneath all the technology and beneath the running of T2F and so on and so forth. And I see her as somebody who really lived her life with art
absolutely.
behind it. And I also want to say that, as you said, life is terrible, terrible things happen. Something terrible happened to her, and we will make something out of that. We will make something artistic so that she also lives on with us.
Thank you for that. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Any questions?
There's a
And please, questions, short questions. I don't want long statements because we haven't got time anyway. So
Is there a microphone that's going on?
There's a microphone in there.
there's a
Yeah,
microphone.
that-
There was a question here. Oh.
Hello. In discussions of myth and fable, lore and magic, a name that often emerges is that of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. In an interview, he described his role as a writer as that of an archaeologist, sort of philologist come linguist in search of these lost words. How important do you feel is this investigative process of unearthing these buried words contained in these myths? Thank you.
Sorry, unearthing? Can you
These
repeat?
buried words
The buried words.
of myths.
You want us to comment on the writer as archaeologist? I mean, is
Or
that your question?
The sort of the archaeology, the process, the vocabulary
Process.
contained in, and how that changes through the ages, and how we sort of find a contemporary angle
I
and
see.
bring these myths back.
That's actually quite an interesting question. How
Okay, I'm going to let the other ladies do this one.
how archaeology is sort of gathered and it's transmuted.
I mean, I think the idea of writer as archaeologist is appealing at many levels, the idea of excavating old histories, but I think specifically you're asking about language, sort of excavating old language. Am I right? It's an interesting one because very often what we think we're doing actually is taking old stories and putting them into new languages. But of course, words are carriers of culture. And one of certainly the sadnesses I was aware of when I was looking back was I was looking at the English language texts of all these things in Peshawar, and I knew I could tell the silences in the subtext and what was going on there. And what Pashto, Hindko evidence might exist around those times, and the different way the stories were being told, was something I didn't have access to. And that's a loss. It would, a work is always a much deeper, richer work if you can go back in and see how things were being expressed. And of course, I mean, the other issue that I suppose we all have is the English language itself is something that in the last 30, 40, 50 years, a lot of writers from post-colonial places have been remaking. But how much of it you can really remake, to what extent the language will always carry a certain colonial burden. I mean, I think these are questions which Marquez didn't have to contend with, but we probably do.
And I mean, I just want to add to that we're also then depending on individual translators. So for instance, when I was traveling in these areas, I was with an Urdu speaker who could speak the local languages, but his interpretation of what was being told to me would be very different from somebody else's. I mean, all of us here are interpreting your question differently. So imagine how somebody from there would interpret a local legend. And I'm sure there are people from there who would disagree with the way I've retold these stories in English. So it is the colonial baggage as well as individual differences, as well as feminine translators versus masculine ones. I mean, the person I was with was a man. And all of this comes into it so that by the time the story reaches the audience, I mean, it's gone through so many mutations. It becomes a myth.
Any more questions?
There's one lady back there.
Is there a question here?
Yeah.
There's a lady back there. If you could.
Hello. Firstly, thank you for being here. It was a pleasure hearing all of you. And my question is regarding South Asian fiction. And basically, do you think there has been a change in history in the writing of South Asian fiction? Is there a like in terms of genre, in terms of style and writing, is there a specific slice of time in history where we can almost be marked as a before and after in South Asian fiction, where something completely changes? And if there is, then what is the impact of that change on the culture, on the generation of today? Because as you said, stories are a part of your bloodstream, of your DNA. I mean, a lot of my morality today is shaped by the stories that I grew up with as a child. So if there is a marked difference, we can almost say that the stories before this time were of a specific style or genre, and after that they completely changed. So is there...
How do stories change if they're posed into South Asian fiction? Is that what you're saying?
No, she's asking, was there within South Asian fiction, is there a before and after? Is there a moment when it has changed
Okay.
in some
Yeah,
significant way?
I wouldn't be able to give you the specific moment, but for me, everything changed when South Asians stopped being written about and started writing about themselves. And you could call this the post-colonial literature movement, although that's so out of fashion these days to call it that, but still, we'll go with it. I think for me, the major change was we stopped being represented and we started representing ourselves. I think that was the biggest change.
Can I just ask you to clarify, are you talking specifically about English language fiction or all the languages of South Asia? English, okay.
English, yes.
Yeah. English. I mean, I suppose the 80s were a fairly significant moment. I think it's sort of, when you had a generation who was the generation after colonization. I mean, I think that, when that next generation, so my mother's generation, when they grew up and around, although this is not to say you didn't have the earlier writers, but I think there was something that happened within the 80s, but that also has to do with publishing houses and marketings and prizes and all that sort of things. And it happened in India first, before it happened here. But I don't know about for the others on the panel, but certainly for me in the 80s, the Indian writers were quite important to read, writing in English. Babsi Sitwa, of course, we had here. But to read people who were from a more familiar world and telling a more familiar history became a very significant moment of fictions can be written about our history and where we are, which is, basically what Beena was talking about.
But even somebody like Hanif Qureshi,
Yeah.
who also the 80s, and he was writing about the hybrids,
Yeah.
who had never been represented before in fiction. I think
Yeah.
that was very significant.
I think also South Asia, such a so many people, so many writers. Whereas in Pakistan, there have been fewer English language writers. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but the last time I was at KLF, somebody raised her hand, and there was a panel on English language fiction, and she said, I've read you all, and I can't relate to any of your books.
Oh, well, yes, okay, yeah, I remember that.
And I thought about that question a lot, because has there been a moment? Maybe we're still waiting for the moment. Maybe because I hear this comment. I hear that what you're writing about doesn't represent us, or what. It's not meant to. But I think it's still something. It's a new idea that we're not representing. That we are still creating our own style, our own language, our own aesthetic, and so we're pretty new at this. And I think over time, as our differences become more apparent, maybe that moment will become more apparent too.
And I think also we need there to be many more genres we're working in, and that's beginning. I mean, you're beginning to get the thriller, the sci-fi book, and all, you need to have much more of that, so that people who don't want to read what we term literary fiction can find their way in sci-fi, in historical romance, in whatever they want.
They were getting that kind of, well, not many, but it is beginning different kind of. I think we have time for one quick question.
It's really a pleasure for a person of my age to be listening to these young writresses writing about us and our myths and our history and our legends. While I was listening to this conversation, I was just thinking maybe a legend, the size of a legend, if I may, from being a local one or being a regional one or being an international one. Probably it depends on the imagination it is able to capture, the size of the size of people. If it remains a local legend, it means it has just captured the imagination of the local environment and the regional and the international. Would you really agree with this assessment?
Why does a legend not become a national legend and it remains a local legend?
I would disagree, actually. I don't think we can deny how much. You hear a lot about the term soft power, right? Part of what soft power is about is disseminating stories. How do stories get spread? Is there some machinery that is pushing these stories forward? Is someone saying, here's a local legend, I'm going to put a lot of money into making it a TV show. I'm going to put a lot of money into sending people from this region to other regions, to other countries to talk about this legend. I mean, I think there is also that, rather than just a question of it failing to capture the imagination. I think there is. I don't think it's so benign a process all the time. In some cases, yes. But in a lot of cases, I think certain stories and myths and legends, there are people who want them to be spread about. There's a machinery that goes into it. We call it PR. Some stories have a lot better PR than others.
I wouldn't mind speaking to that as well, because I think what you're talking about is, here's a figure, Benazir Bhutto, for example, Malala Yousafzai, whoever, and we tend to only look at them through the political lens. We only look at them as a political figure. But the making of a legend requires us to step back from that very narrow field of vision and look at the person more artistically. You're treating somebody, and legend doesn't come from newspapers and it doesn't come from academic books. It comes from novels, from painting, from music, from song, from the stage, from theater. So the more we take these figures and we treat them in the artistic field, they will become legendary. As long as we only keep them in the political sense, they will only be historical.
I think time is. Do you have any comment?
It's okay.
Well, thank you very much, and I think time is up. Although we have more questions, but thank you, Veena, Uzma, and Kamla.
Thank you. Thank you, Muniza.